Everybody. So the purpose of this video is to explain to you and walk you through the parts of a lesson plan. And also at the end, I'm going to walk you through your modules for this week because it looks a little different. So this is our typical lesson plan template we use at BGSU. We use this template because this is the template that you will use for EdTPA, which you'll do your senior year during methods and student teaching. So this top portion right here is just background information about your student and your units and your standards. Then the first important thing that we get to is central focus or central question. They mean the exact same thing. The difference is, do you want to write a question or do you want to write a statement? That's it. The most important part about the central focus or central question is that it has to be broad. It has to cover not only more than one lesson, but more than one topic. So you don't want it to be too specific. Like if it works for your whole unit, but it on Pythagorean theorem, but it only works for that unit, it's too specific. So here are some examples. Here's 150 math essential questions. So something we might see in algebra is, do mathematical models conceal as much as they reveal? So as you can tell, I could use that for hundreds of lessons, and that's the point. I actually use this document a lot, and I can upload it if you would. Like, just let me know. So that's an essential question, just something very broad. It kind of, the way I think about it is it gives you an overview of what skills we're trying to build in this lesson. Next is lesson rationale and summary. So there's two things here. The summary I'll start with is a brief 3 to 4 sentence overview of what you're doing in this lesson. The way I think about that is if you are like, oh, I can't remember what lesson I did last year. Let me look it up. And you're looking for this lesson. You're going to be able to read that 3 or 4 sentence summary and know what this lesson is about without reading the entire 3-page document. So that's why summary is helpful. The second part is the rationale. And this is increasingly important for EdTPA because this is talking about, why am I teaching this? Why is it important? Why am I teaching it in the way that I'm teaching it? So you're not only talking about what you're teaching, or but why you're teaching it and why you're teaching it in the manner that you are. So this is your when we think about claims, evidence, and justification, this is your justification for your lesson plan. I'm teaching Pythagorean theorem using a model listing activity because, or I do a lot of stuff with representations and manipulatives. And so like in here, I might talk about, I'm doing this because I'm following Bruner's 3 levels of representation. And so when we do our LP on learning theories at the end of the semester, that's going to be critically important to you because I want you to use that list of theorists to help you with this rationale part of your lesson plan. All right, next part stands for mathematical content, stands for mathematical practice. You know what those are. We've gone over them before. I think that this is important though, 1 to 2 standards at most. Unless you're doing like a 5-day lesson that covers multiple standards, it really should only be 1 to 2. Now sometimes you're going to think, oh, but I'm kind of covering this other one. Don't list that though. That's not the main focus. The way I think about it, especially for SMPs, is like, from engaging in class that we cover more than one SMP usually at a time, but it's usually pretty obvious which one we're focusing on, and so that's the one you want to list to. Sorry, I have a cough. Anyway, so next is learning objectives. These are, I'm sure you've heard the word SWABAT before. Students will be able to. And so you usually have 1 to 3 objectives for the day, definitely never more than 3, because you have to, especially for EdTPA, you have to prove that your students met your objective by the end of the period. And so to have them meet 3 objectives by the end of the period is a lot. So this usually looks like students will be able to, what's important is we want to make sure that we're saying what they're able to do, but we don't want to just list, like, students will be able to use a calculator. Okay, Like, yes, they're going to use a calculator in their lesson, but is that really your goal for them for the day? And so we usually relate these back to levels of Bloom's taxonomy. So I have those over here. So these are the 6 levels. Remember is the lowest level of understanding, and create is the highest. So you want to try to, I would say, try to stay in these top 3. You're going to have days when you're in remember, understand, or apply. You're gonna. But if you focus more on trying to get them up in these top 3, that's really going to help you. So for example, my students this week, we just learned about, we were doing statistics last week. So this week, to prove to me that they understand statistics like histograms and mean, median, mode, and range, and Basilisca plot, instead of just having them apply the information, execute, implement, solve problems where they have to make those, I had them do that. But on top of that, I had them analyze and evaluate. So what I had them do is I had them read an article about coronavirus that uses the statistics we were talking about, and then analyze that statistical data and talk about, did they think that the argument that the author was making was valid based on their analysis of the data. So as you can tell, that's a lot more critical thinking up here in these top 3 than it would have been if I would have said, create a histogram, here's your data. Uh, so that's something to think about. Also, make sure that these objectives align with your standards. That needs to be very clear. And sometimes I see teachers like, this objective aligns with this standard, and that's okay. Academic language, this is usually just a list of vocabulary that's going to be important for the students to know. Some of it will be vocabulary that the students will learn during the lesson. Other parts of this will be vocabulary that, like, prerequisite knowledge that the students should have going into this lesson. So they should know about this from previous lessons. But it's important to put this in here because you have to be able to say, if they don't know it from previous lessons, what are you going to do? Okay, planned assessment. Um, 3 types, really 2 types, formative and summative, because I would argue that pre-assessment is a formative assessment. So what you're going to list in this section is what assessments you're going to use. Formative is usually used during that lesson. Summative could be in the future. Here's the thing. I've seen people say, oh, my assessment is observing my students. Okay, that does count as an assessment, but what data did you collect besides what you observed? And how do you know you observed everybody? So your assessment should be tangible. So you have 2 types, formative and summative, which you've read about at this point. So formative assessment is to help direct your instruction, meaning you're assessing the students not to give them a grade, not to be like, oh, you don't know it, okay, whatever, I'm moving on, but to be like, what do my students know and what do they not know, and how is that going to help me teach them differently tomorrow? So if you give a formative assessment and you just taught a lesson on quadratic formula, and now half the kids didn't do really well on your assessment, you're not going to give them all an F. You're just going to say, okay, well, what do I need to reteach tomorrow? Or what do I need to teach tomorrow? So that will be listed in here. So that could look like exit slips. It could look like I have kids put post-it notes on the board. I have kids do surveys, like how do they feel about meeting those objectives, 1 to 5, justify your reasoning. It could be a number of things. Like I can't even list it. Well, if you read formative 5, it'll give you some ideas. Then summative assessment is whatever you're doing to say, okay, I'm rating the student's understanding of this concept, and that's the thing that goes in the gradebook. Now, my argument is summative assessments can also be formative. You can use them to inform your instruction. So if I give a test over graphing linear functions and everyone gets a 75%, okay, that's still pretty good. But that means when I start my next chapter on writing linear functions, I'm going to make sure that we go back over some things from graphing that my kids are still struggling with. So summative assessments are usually tests and quizzes, but I'm really going to challenge you guys to come up with different ways to assess your students. So for example, things that I've done in the past is I had my kids make a test. So they had to make their own test and then write the answer key, and then that was their test to prove that they knew it. I've had them do presentations. I've had them make like websites to demonstrate their knowledge, things like that. So that is assessments. Okay, differentiated instructional strategies. Okay, pause. There are two ways to do differentiation in your classroom. There's differentiation and there's universal design for learning. You can choose whichever one makes the most sense for you. But here's what I'm going to tell you. Differentiation means here's what I'm going to do for most of my students, but then for this particular student who maybe is on an IP or 504, I'm going to do this. For this particular student, I'm going to do this. For this particular student, I'm going to do this. And so the reason I don't like to use differentiation is my first year of teaching, I had a class of 28 students. 14 of my 28 were on IEPs. And then I had 2 English language learners in my classroom on top of that. So for me to design instruction that's different for every single one of those students every single day is nearly impossible to do. And so that's why I use universal design for learning. So let me go over that with you. So universal design for learning is composed of 3 parts. And the whole premise of UDL is that I create one lesson, but within that lesson, I provide all these different options for students. And so then it's meeting the needs of all of my students. So you walk through, provide multiple means of representation. So usually my lessons include a hands-on manipulative option, a picture option, and an algebraic representation. It also might mean that, like for this thing where my students had to read an article, I gave them different articles to choose from, and one of those was an audio article where it's read to you. So if they don't want to read, that's an option for them. Right there is an instructional strategy that meets the needs of all my students. Part 2, provide multiple means of action expression. So again, this is the idea of like, do you want to have a physical copy? Do you want to have it on a Chromebook? Do you want to have manipulatives in front of you? Do you want to draw a picture? Do you want to read it? Do you want to listen to it? These are all options where my students have different tools that they can use to help them understand based on whatever makes the most sense for them. And then the last part is engagement, provide multiple means of engagement. And this is my favorite part, I think, is so this is provide options for recruiting interest. So optimize individual choice and autonomy. So giving them choice in what they're going to do. So just like this week where I had my students read the articles, I had 5 different articles. One was about the economy. One was about like a survey done. One was about coronavirus. You know what I mean? So I gave them all these different options, and so then they could choose whichever one sounded the most interesting to them. Provide options for sustaining effort and persistence. So this means like this is where I really like to use group work. So I can say maybe we do a think, pair, share, which is what we do a lot in class. I do a lot in class with you all is work by yourself, work with a partner, work with the whole group, whole class discussion. And so giving them that chance to talk, or think about like in the Japanese video where the teacher put a hint on the board, or they could talk to the teacher, or they could talk to the student teacher. Like that's giving students options for how to be successful. And so promote options for self-regulation. So like especially if I do a big project with my students, I always have them say, what did you get done today? What are you going to get done tomorrow? And helping them to think about where they're at and where they're going. And so this is UDL. And so what happens here is instead of me making 10 different assignments for one class, I'm now making one assignment for one class, but I've made it in a way that it meets all of my students at whatever level they're at. And so that's why I really like a UDL approach as opposed to differentiation. But either way, that's what you have to talk about in this section. And I know that seems like a lot, but that's what you need to talk about. So depending on your students and what kind of learners you have in your classroom, this could be a very long section. This could be a very short section. It's up to you. Okay, list of resources. Pretty straightforward. What do the kids need? Put citations in there if you're using it from like an online resource. Okay, here's the lesson plan. So as you can see, we've gone through 2 pages and only now we're getting into what are we going to do for the day. So the first part is readiness, motivation, engage, whatever you want to call So this is like, how are you going to get your students into this lesson? How are you going to connect it to previous material? What background do the students need to have? So for example, I did a lesson with my students on contagion. This was before coronavirus, so just know that. But on contagion and the spread of pandemics. And uh, my introduction to this is like, we watched a video clip from the movie Contagion, which literally talks on the first day there was one person, then two, then four, then 16, in 3 months, 1 billion people. And so from showing them that video, it got them excited about the lesson. It got them, I asked them, like, what do you notice? What do you wonder from that video clip? And it got them engaged in thinking about what math they knew and how it could relate to what we were going to watch and things like that. So that's the motivation. And then you're going to put some sort of assessment for that. How do you know you're going to move on? Motivation should take 5 to 10 minutes. So sometimes for me, it's just a warm up. We do a number talk. We do a notice and wonder. We do a what's golden, whatever it is. So that is your first part. Second part is your central lesson or activity. So this is the bulk of the lesson. I would say this is 80 to 90% of your time in class. What is your task going to be? What are students going to do? And this needs to be step by step. So think about, like, if you had a substitute teacher coming in your room, could they pick up this lesson plan and read it and know exactly what to do? So you're going to write things in here like, the teacher will say blah, 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 blah. Then the teacher will pass out the handout. Then the teacher will, whatever it is. And like I know there's going to be times when you're like, do I really need to write that? But you need to think about, like, are you going to pass out the handout and then explain the instructions? Or are you going to give the instructions and then pass out the handout? Because I'll tell you right now, one of those works better. And I want you to think about which one. Also, you're going to put things in here about what questions do you think students are going to ask? When students are working on this task, I expect them to have these questions. Here's how I'm going to address them. What questions are you going to ask students? When students are working, if they're stuck, I'm going to ask them this. If they're doing well, I'm going to ask them this. If I want to push them and extend on the lesson, I'm going to ask them this. All those things need to be in here. And I know this is going to seem time consuming, but because you haven't been in the classroom that much, thinking through every minute detail of your lesson is really going to help you here. And in closure, how are you going to tie the lesson together at the end? How will you set up tomorrow's lesson? This is not an exit slip. That is the biggest mistake I see people make. They're like, oh, my closure is we did an exit slip. Well, did that really tie up anything for your students? Did that help them think about what you're going to do tomorrow? So like, for example, when I did my contagion lesson, the bulk of our lesson was us simulating the spread of those diseases. Like, we were walking around shaking hands and thinking about how it spreads. And so my closure was, okay, let's look at those questions you created at the beginning of class about what did you notice and wonder from the video? What did we answer? What do we still have left to answer? Which ultimately led us to saying, well, in the video it said in 3 months 1 billion people would be infected. We didn't answer that. Well, that was the perfect thing for my students to say, because that's what we were doing the next day of class. So that's what the closure looks like. Assign any homework, and then your assessment is down here at the bottom. So that is the lesson plan. So now what I want to do is walk you through what you're going to do this week. I have too many tabs open. Okay, so if you go to modules for this week and go down to lesson plan, here's what you're going to do. Read this section of principles to action. Here's that lesson plan template I just gave you. I'll upload the video in here. Here is a lesson plan. So if you click it, here's what it looks like, a filled in one. On area of irregular polygons. So there's that. So you're going to read through that, and then what you're going to do is you're going to go to this lesson plan evaluation. So if you open it in a new tab, you're going to fill out this Google form. So what's your name? And then you're going to rate things from a 0 to 3. So on that lesson plan, I'll go back to it. On this lesson plan, from a 0 to a 3, we're going to look at this essential question. How can you find the area of different figures? Do you think it was a good essential question, a 3? There wasn't an essential question, it was a 0, it was kind of good, or it was okay, it was kind of good, it was really good. And then explain why you ranked it from a 0 to a 3. And then once everyone is done for the week, then I will post the results to see if we're all kind of on the same page. And then the last thing, which I didn't add yet, but I'll do right now, is I'm going to add a discussion board to LP7, but the discussion board is not going to be, it's not going to be for you guys to talk to each other. It's going to be, what questions do you have about lesson planning? Put it in the discussion board, and then I will try to answer all those for you guys. So I hope this video has been helpful. I miss you all, and please let me know if you have any questions. I will talk to you later.